are loving you. Mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, sisters and brothers, friends for life, won't live in the past. All I wanna do now is making it
Trauma.
last.
There are a lot of persons listening or watching this that just that very word probably evokes a lot of emotions. Welcome to Make It Last podcast. I'm your host, Nurinder. It's all about helping us to have better relationships, not just with ourselves, with other people. We're going to be talking about trauma, how you can overcome trauma, and then, of course, have healthier relationships. So we're going to be doing that with Jonathan McLernon, who is in Canada. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here.
Trauma, why do you think you can talk about this
Yeah.
particular
And I'll
issue?
put one quick disclaimer in. Of course, this is for information and education purposes only. This can't be construed as medical advice.
Okay, good.
We'll put that out there. But
Okay.
so I myself have been through trauma. So I
Hmm.
have lived experience, as well as my nutritional certifications focus on behavioral psychology as well. So it gives me a lens with which to understand the behavior. So I look at I have my own personal experience as well as my professional education. And that gives me a lens where I go, well, all behavior makes sense. So let's look to understand the behavior and where it's coming from.
Okay. So with that being said, what then is trauma?
Um, in its simplest form, it's any kind of intense human experience that creates overwhelming emotion. And trauma isn't something that we can necessarily, how do I put it? We don't want to get into a comparison contest. I'm going to say it politely.
Okay.
We don't, so what is traumatic for one person may not be for another person. So there's a
That's true.
relative
That's
nature to
true.
trauma. So it depends to some degree on the level of emotional resilience we might have. And so, I went through a traumatic experience and I really wasn't equipped to process it. And it probably took me 8 years to work my way through the PTSD and sort of mental health struggles that I had. But I think on the other side of that, that sounds like a long time. But I'm
Hmm.
here today doing what I do because I went through that. And so it might sound strange, but I'm actually really grateful that I did because it now gives me much greater insight into human behavior and allows me to work with my clients in kind of a really different capacity.
Okay. Are you care to share a little bit about that before
Mm-hmm.
we continue the conversation?
Yeah. So I was living in South Africa, working for a nonprofit organization, helping underprivileged youth. And at that time, we were out on a nature reserve. And one night I was going back to my cabin, which was kind of tucked away from all of the facilities, and four men attacked me and tried to beat me to death. And so it was, in a nutshell, obviously it was a very traumatic and terrifying kind of experience to go through.
Hmm.
And so the fallout of that is I really didn't know how to deal with it. A lot of emotions, deep emotions come up. So whenever we take an experience and we attach a deep,
Hmm.
intense, burning emotion to it that like touches us right to the core, um, that's something traumatic in nature. And the spillover from that is, I would experience random surges of like waves of emotion that were overwhelmingly powerful. Sometimes it was fear, sometimes it was anger or rage. It was really, and so now I was existing in this sort of like a pendulum swinging and
Hmm.
really felt like very out of control because I didn't want this to be happening, but it was all taking place in my head. And then to try to conceal it because I felt that most people they wouldn't understand what was happening because of course they hadn't been through that experience. And most people, we have a maybe a textbook sort of understanding of trauma to some degree in our head, but we
Hmm.
don't really understand sort of the lived element to it. And so it meant that I was spending a lot of time just trying to hide what happened to me and hide the inner turmoil that I was living through.
How then did you overcome all of this? For you, is it something you can describe as a step-by-step process, or how did you
Probably.
overcome all of this?
And I would say I wouldn't necessarily take this as a template to follow, but I
Okay.
would say listen, and is there something of value for you in this that you could take a principle and maybe shape it to work for yourself if you're listening.
Okay. Fair
So
enough.
for me, the first thing I it was about 6 months after the incident, and I think I was just getting emotionally exhausted from being angry all the time,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I didn't want to be angry anymore. And so I made the decision in my heart that I was going to forgive the men who did this to me. Now, you might wonder, how do you do that when these men, if they saw me again, would do it again, without a trace of conscience? So how do you forgive that sort of thing? So for me, it
Mm-hmm.
was, I asked the question: what happens in someone's life that brings them to the place where this is what they're doing?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to excuse the behavior. It's not a get out of jail
Yes.
free card,
Yes.
but it's a lens of compassion where we go, how did you get there? And we know that hurting people hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in that sense, I was able to cultivate a degree of compassion for these men, that something happened to bring them to this place. So then, when the rage and the anger and sort of the reliving it and trying to rewrite it and so on was all taking place in my head, I would consciously try to cultivate a sense of compassion for them and forgive them so that I could set myself free, really, because
Yes.
they still have to answer for what they did at some point in time in their life. But for me, it meant the experience didn't hold power over me anymore.
Mm. Okay. That's forgiveness. What
Yes.
else?
Well, so now I had to address my relationship with myself and my mental health. And I will say, like, this took place over a number of years. This didn't take place in just a couple of weeks' time.
Mm-hmm.
So I now developed a disordered relationship with my body because my way of coping with trauma was food. And so I became a binge eating food addict and gained 120 pounds and was now obese. And so I struggled with this for a number of years. Um, but about 2017, I hired a coach. And I would say, don't try to do this alone. If this is something you're struggling
Okay.
through, don't, trauma isn't something that we're really wired to do on our own or do in isolation. Like, professional help and professional support is tremendous. So but working with this coach, it was really helpful because he modeled for me what compassion and self-compassion look like. So I was able to extend it to other people, but at this point in my life or in my experience, I seemed unable to extend it to myself. And that perhaps stemmed from a belief that I held about masculinity and compassion and self-love and self-care and what all of this looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So when I saw it modeled for me and towards me by someone who I looked up and respected, um, it felt like, okay, maybe this is something safe for me to pursue because I now know what this looks like, and this doesn't diminish me as a person to begin practicing this. So trying to restore my relationship to myself and my body through practicing self-care and self-compassion. And part of that means getting curious about my own experience. So not necessarily trying to rush to smother any difficult emotions that I feel, but to actually feel them and maybe even recognize that while they're really, really uncomfortable, they can't physically hurt me and they can't break me. And so
Mm.
we're more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. Human beings are incredibly resilient. So that was kind of the next step, really. And then I think as I became more comfortable with myself and my
Mm-hmm.
experience and my struggles, I started to become okay talking about them and sharing it with people and saying, and this may not be for everybody to do this, but because they would only see sort of surface level behaviors and they wouldn't really understand what was going on, of course, because you don't just walk up and sort of spill your guts and tell your life history to someone who's just met you.
Yes.
But maybe I would just explain to them, hey, I went through a really difficult experience in my life, and this is kind of what happened, and this was the result of that. So when I stopped feeling shame around my human struggles, that lifted a burden as well.
You're for those who were around you who probably weren't even aware of all of that. How then did you find a way to, how do I spell, not project all of that anger and all of that how did you do that?
Well, for most of my experience, I was smothering it with food, trying to use something to change the channel in my head, so to not feel it, because I'm not a violent person, but
Okay.
I had violent thoughts coming into my head and violent urges and things, and I never acted on them. And so it can be, that in itself can be really, really distressing for people, because after you've been traumatized, there can be this desire to do that, to try to take back something that was taken from you and to take it back in the manner which it was taken from you. And so it was interesting for me to learn not to judge the thoughts that entered my head.
Hmm.
That's really, could we say, almost like a next level type of self-awareness. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
ask for these thoughts. I don't want to act on these thoughts, but they are in my head. And so I learned how to meditate. And meditation is an interesting practice because we probably have already preconceived ideas about it, but
Mm-hmm.
now it's a little bit more mainstream. But really for me, it was just about being able to observe the thoughts in my head. So it's almost like becoming a third-party observer of your own head and go, this thought comes, I don't have to attach to it, I don't have to judge it, I can just watch it float away. And it took a number of months of practicing this to sort of develop this skill. It's not something that came to me naturally to do, but it got to the point because, of course, a thought could trigger a series of thoughts that brings me down the rabbit hole and back to a dark place that I don't want to go.
Yes.
And so if I don't attach to the thought, then it's a little bit easier to not be triggered by it.
Trauma is not something to take lightly because it impacts on all of our relationships. And what might be traumatic for me might not necessarily be traumatic for you. We take a break with a word from our partners.
Are you looking for one-of-a-kind products customized to suit your needs? Then shop at Trending Things, the place where customization is always an option. From personalized gifts to apparel, accessories, drinkware, and home decor, you name it, we make it. Get your favorite designs on any item for party favors, weddings, graduations, or any special occasion, all at affordable prices. What are you waiting for? Visit our website at trendingthings.com to order your trendy item today. Trending Things, bringing creativity to the things you love.
So, the whole idea of a branding strategy sounded so exotic and so fancy to me. But after having several conversations with Neon, I now have a clearer understanding. I am sure of what my identity is, what it is that I want people to see Noreen Daly as. Thanks, Neon. Thanks, Splint. Visit them at wearesplint.com.
Photography is an art, but more so, photography must come from the heart. Precious moments, priceless times. Take a pic and know it will turn out fine.
BMC Photography JA. Beautiful moments captured. Let's go.
For all your events such as educational forums, workshops, book launches, weddings, and more, contact Noreen Daly, the ultimate MC and event host. Visit noreendaly.com or follow her on Instagram at Noreen Daly Jam. Noreen Daly, creating long-lasting memories.
A lot of people, if you're not careful, will try to trivialize whatever traumatic experience you've had. But let's continue the conversation and then let's find a way to make our acceptance of each other a little better. Welcome back to the conversation. Triggers whole idea of forgiveness. It is a difficult concept for a lot of people who are listening and watching this. And I know that you said at least 2-3 times in the conversation that it's not something that happened in a matter of weeks. It took years. So of course, if there's somebody who's still going through their own trauma, I'm hoping that they'll get the idea that, hey, don't be too hard on yourself because healing takes time.
It does.
And I think sometimes because of the intensity of the trauma, it will take a much longer period for some people.
Absolutely. I'm really glad that you brought that up. And you see, for me, it was one major incident and a series of small incidences that layered on top of that while we were still living down there. So an unhealed trauma can sort of have multiple layers added to it, if I could put it that way. But for some people, it may have started in childhood. It may have started with, and it may have happened repeatedly hundreds and hundreds of times. And so, and I share that because sometimes I felt guilty that maybe there was only one major traumatic incident and a series of smaller ones. That, why is this such a struggle for me when some people have gone through like years of trauma through childhood or abusive relationships or sexual abuse or things like that? Don't do that. Trauma is not a competition.
I'm glad you said that. Because I believe sometimes that even when people get to the point where they're willing to share, because somebody else might be in that space and they might say, but so why are you getting yourself so worked up about that? I've been through that. And yet I am still standing, or I'm still, as you said, it's really not a competition. And inadvertently, sometimes when people do that, it almost seems as if they're trivializing what to them is not as heavy as what they've been through.
And I might build on that. So very often in the beginning, when people heard what happened to me, their first response was to say, "Oh, that's nothing. You should hear what happened too," and proceed to tell me a horrific story.
Wow.
And it was like, well, that's just making it worse, because you use that word trivialize, and it's exactly just invalidating my experience and what I felt. So for someone to go, "Oh, that's nothing." Now, I can take a step back in my current sort of position now and having done quite a bit of work and go, I think I understand why this happens. So, for example, if I was about to share an uncomfortable story that would bring about uncomfortable emotions in somebody else, and they don't have the same maybe degree of emotional awareness that I do, they're not comfortable with these emotions, so the response is quick, shut it down. I don't want to feel this. And so it's not to say that it's a helpful behavior, but at least we can understand that when someone says, "Oh, that's nothing," that's them saying, "I am uncomfortable with the emotion that you are bringing up in me, and this is my way of shutting it down."
It bothers me, or it saddens me to some respect when it is that there are not enough safe spaces for people to have that kind of conversation, because not everybody can talk through something, but I do believe at some point being able to share helps with the healing.
Oh, it does. There's something about being heard and being validated. And I think here's another really important point to share. If somebody is sharing with you something that has happened to them, they are not asking you to fix it. They are not putting the responsibility on you, nor should you feel that it is your responsibility to fix it. So, for example, I do a type of nutrition coaching, but it's really behavioral psychology based. So I say science of metabolism, psychology of behavior change, and the compassion of human connection. So my clients will come to me, and they're going to share with me some really difficult things that have happened to them. Sometimes it's sexual trauma going back to childhood. These are not easy things to hear. And it's like when you start working with someone in the realm of nutrition, the last thing you're expecting is to hear, "I was sexually assaulted by my uncle when I was 6 years old." That's pretty heavy. That's just one example. But for me, I have to resist the urge of saying, "Let me try to fix that for you." Instead, we say, "I'm going to sit with you." So we talk about safe space and holding space. And these terms sound almost a little bit cliche, but what we're really describing is you and I being present as human beings, just in each other's presence and finding comfort in that. No need to fix, no need to correct, just hear and just witness. Just witness somebody else's experience without judgment, without trying to fix it. And that's like the best thing you could do. And you know what? Sometimes it's uncomfortable and you go, "I don't know what to say. I don't have words." That's allowed. You can say that. You could ask, "Would you like a hug? Could I give you a hug right now? That would make me feel better," And so just, there's no responsibility to fix it when somebody shares.
As we're wrapping up, Jonathan, trauma, for me, I am hoping if nobody gets anything else from this conversation, is the whole idea that it's really not a competition, But for you, what is the one idea that you'd want to leave with those who watch and those who listen?
I think just what we talked about. It isn't your responsibility to fix somebody else's struggle. If you have the humanity to just listen and be present with someone, even when you're feeling uncomfortable emotions about what you're hearing. That's the best thing you could do. That's the best way you could help somebody. Just be a human being with them in that experience. That's a beautiful thing.
Excellent note to end this conversation. Thank you so much for sharing, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
This was Making It Last podcast, where it's all about helping us to have better relationships, not just with ourselves, with other people. I'm Noreen Daly. Until next time.
You loving me, I loving you. Mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, sisters and brothers, friends for life, won't live in the past. All I wanna do now is making it last.